Cuba and Nicaragua. Introduction. Drug trafficking knows neither national nor ideological boundaries, as evidenced by allegations of Cuban and Sandinista involvement in the drug trade. The subcommittee received testimony that throughout the 1980s, Cuba has been used by drug traffickers as a transit point and haven for laundering money. Cuban authorities have provided smugglers with protection for their boats and aircraft. According to subcommittee testimony, Fidel Castro himself acted as a mediator on behalf of General Manuel Antonio Noriega in disputes Noriega has had with the Medellin cocaine cartel. Finally, the subcommittee received testimony that Cuban officials were involved in efforts to establish ties between leftist revolutionary groups such as M19 and cocaine traffickers. Several witnesses testified that Nicaraguan officials were also involved in drug trafficking. The subcommittee also received testimony that representatives of the Medellin cartel entered into negotiations with the Sandinista government over using Nicaragua for drug trafficking operations. Finally, the subcommittee received testimony regarding alleged statements by leaders of the cartel that they provided assistance to the Sandinistas. Historical background. Pre-revolutionary Cuba had an extensive tradition as a base for the smuggling of illegal goods to the United States, as far back as the 18th century, and continuing through Prohibition to the overthrow of the Batista government by Castro. The United States has frequently sought the cooperation of the Cuban government in stopping such smuggling. By the time of the Castro Revolution, organized crime had a significant position of power in Cuba based on the wealth it had accumulated by smuggling and related illegal operations. At the time of the Cuban Revolution, Castro himself claimed one of his objectives was to cleanse Cuba of the environment of corruption. Since then, Castro has conducted a highly visible public campaign against smuggling, and the government of Cuba regularly issues reports highlighting its successes in the war against drugs. The subcommittee received testimony that despite Cuba's aggressive public stance against narcotics, during the 1980s, Cuban officials had again begun to provide assistance to drug smugglers. Cuba as a way station for smugglers. Cuba lies on the most direct air route from South America to Florida. Due to its size, unless smugglers get overflight rights, hundreds of miles are added to their trips. This greatly increases the risk of getting caught and forces traffickers to decrease the payloads they carry. Quite naturally, as the volume of drugs moving into South Florida by air increased in the early 1980s, the traffickers became interested in obtaining overflight rights from the Cubans. Elements of the Cuban government began to offer assistance. According to smugglers, this assistance was gradually extended to refueling and repair services, assistance in laundering money, and providing safe haven from U.S. law enforcement authorities. Luis Garcia told the subcommittee that in late 1979 or early 1980, Cuban officials offered him use of airstrips for refueling drug flights. While Garcia said he never took them up on the offer, he was aware of other smugglers who did. Over time, according to the subcommittee testimony, several different smuggling organizations were able to reach an understanding with Cuban officials that enabled them to use that country to facilitate their operations. Other testimony concerning Cuban involvement in drug operations came from Richard Gregory, whose office obtained grand jury indictments against a number of Cuban officials. In the 1983 case of United States v. Jaime Guillot Lara, 4 high-ranking Cuban officials were implicated in drug smuggling. They included a member of the Cuban Communist Party's Central Committee, Fernando Ravelo Renedo, the former Cuban ambassador to Colombia, the former minister-counselor of the Cuban embassy in Colombia, and a vice admiral of the Cuban Navy. The 4 officials were indicted for their role in a smuggling conspiracy, but were never brought to trial because they never came within the jurisdiction of the United States. All of the other co-conspirators in the case were convicted by a jury which received testimony about the involvement of the 4 Cuban officials. In 1988, a grand jury indicted Reynaldo Ruiz and Hugo Cabellos based on videotaped evidence that showed Cuban military protection was provided to cocaine traffickers coming to the United States from Colombia. Both are scheduled to go to trial. Case history: George Morales. The experience of Colombian drug trafficker George Morales provided insight into the opportunities afforded narcotics traffickers by Cuban authorities. According to Morales, he first developed a relationship with Cuban officials in 1979. Morales testified that he attended a meeting in Cuba at which Cuban officials offered to sell him planes seized for violating their airspace. He developed the relationship over a period of time. By 1980, he obtained Cuba's agreement to allow his pilots overflight rights through Cuban airspace. In return for U.S. currency, Cuban authorities provided Morales with identification codes, enabling him and his pilots to use their airspace safely and land in the event of an emergency. According to Morales, Cuban assistance was then extended to protection for boats and aircraft used in drug smuggling operations. Morales was also given the opportunity to buy drugs Cuban authorities had seized from other traffickers. Morales testified that the Cubans sold him the radio frequencies of the U.S. Coast Guard, Secret Service, Drug Enforcement Agency, Customs, and local U.S. law enforcement agencies. He said their only motivation was obtaining U.S. dollars. Morales testified that Cuban cooperation with him did not end after his 1984 indictment. Instead, the Cubans offered him the opportunity to relocate his entire smuggling operations in Cuba. He testified that Cuban officials offered him a house, an operational runway, and the use of Cuban banking facilities. Although he did not move to Cuba, Morales said he used a Cayo Largo bank to launder over $500,000 in drug money. From Cayo Largo, Morales was able to transfer his drug money to other banks around the world. Ideological use of drugs. In the late 1970s, Castro identified what has been referred to as the natural marriage between the drug traffickers and revolutionaries. The traffickers have the money which the revolutionaries need to launch their operations, and the revolutionaries control the land and the people the traffickers need to grow the crops and run the processing laboratories. Jose Blandón told the subcommittee of Castro's decision to become involved with the traffickers. According to Blandón, in the late 1970s, Castro decided to use the growing power of drug traffickers and drug money to export revolution throughout Latin America. Castro's overall aim was to influence events in Central America by simultaneously aligning himself with narcotics traffickers and regional military leaders, following the example set by General Noriega in Panama. Castro pursued this policy by working closely with the M-19. The M-19 received advice and assistance from the government of Cuba, even as it reached a working agreement with the cartels following their war in Colombia. Maintaining a relationship between the cartel and the various Colombian guerrilla movements has been a significant policy goal of the Cuban government. Blandón testified that Castro assigned the Cuban ambassador to Colombia, Ravelo Renedo, the task of mediating the relationship between the guerrillas and the cartel. According to Blandón, Ravelo Renedo reported to Manuel Piñero, the head of the Cuban Communist Party's Latin American department. A witness at the Miami conspiracy trial in which Ravelo Renedo was an indicted co-conspirator quoted the high-ranking Cuban officials as saying, quote, "We'll drown them, the Americans, in drugs," end quote. Cuba, Panama, and the cartel. Castro's role as a mediator was not limited to disputes between the guerrillas and the cartels. According to Jose Blandón, Castro also acted as a mediator in a dispute between the Medellin cartel and Noriega. The dispute arose when Noriega raided a cartel laboratory in the Darien province of Panama in June 1984, arresting 23 employees of the cartel and seizing millions of dollars worth of equipment and drugs, after accepting $5 million from the cartel to protect it. The cartel decided to kill Noriega in revenge, and Noriega turned to Castro for help. At Noriega's request, Blandón met with Castro in Havana on June 21st or 22nd, 1984. Castro recommended that Noriega return the $5 million in protection money and return the plant, personnel, and equipment to the cartel. During his testimony, Blandón produced photographs of himself with Castro, which he said were taken during that meeting. The photographs were sent to Blandón by Cuban intelligence 3 months after the meeting. They were made part of the hearing record and were used by the Miami grand jury which indicted Noriega. Blandón testified that a week later, on June 27th or 28th, Noriega and Castro met directly in a meeting that lasted 5 to 6 hours. At its conclusion, Noriega told Blandón that, quote, everything had been arranged and they were going to proceed according to Castro's proposal, end quote. Although a deal with the cartel had been concluded, Noriega was still concerned that his life was in danger, as about 100 members of the cartel were living in Panama. The Cubans sent a 25-soldier military unit to fly back with Noriega to Panama to ensure his safety until the terms of the deal with the cartel could be carried out. Castro denies involvement. Fidel Castro personally denounced the Blandón testimony as a fabrication in a lengthy interview with an NBC reporter. He denied the allegations that he mediated the dispute between Noriega and the cartel. In addition, Castro said that Cuba was not involved in drug trafficking and offered to prove it. He said that if the subcommittee members would visit Cuba, they would see irrefutable evidence proving that Blandón had lied. Senator Kerry, the subcommittee chairman, told a representative of the Cuban interest section in Washington that he would not visit Cuba unless staff was permitted to advance the trip and unless the Cubans agreed to discuss the drug trafficking problem in general. Senator Kerry also requested that subcommittee staff be allowed to interview Robert Vesco during the course of the visit. The Cubans never replied to any of these requests and never made any further arrangements for the visit. As a consequence, the trip never took place. Allegations concerning Nicaragua. In 1984, the cartel explored using Nicaragua as a site for the transshipment of cocaine and money laundering. Finding alternatives to Colombia was important because the Colombian authorities had raided and destroyed several cartel laboratories in the Amazon region. Further, Colombian authorities dramatically increased their pressure on cartel operations after the murder of Justice Minister Laura Bonilla. In Panama, where a base of operations had been established, General Noriega was demanding increased control of the drug trade and a larger share of the profits. Floyd Carlton testified that Pablo Escobar sent him to Nicaragua twice in 1984. The first time he went with Ricardo Bolinic, a business partner of General Noriega's, to deliver money. Carlton said he did not know who the money was for since Bolinic handled the delivery. The second trip to Nicaragua was to locate airstrips which could be used for the transshipment of narcotics. Carlton was told by another pilot that the cartel needed long-range planes and airstrips with extended runways to handle flights carrying cocaine paste from Bolivia to Nicaragua. This led Carlton to assume there were processing laboratories in Nicaragua. During the same period, Escobar asked Ramon Milian Rodriguez to explore the possibility of starting drug-related operations in Nicaragua, documenting them, and then using the information to bargain with the United States for amnesty. Ramon Milian Rodriguez's account of this request is supported by the testimony of a Miami attorney who first met with lawyers for the cartel in Bogota in 1985, and later with all the cartel leaders in Medellin. In October 1986, the Miami attorney began talking to the FBI and the DEA about his meetings with the cartel. He was given a polygraph examination, which he passed. He told the DEA that during early 1986, a Bogota lawyer for the cartel told him that the cartel wanted to make, quote, a deal with the U.S. government for immunity from prosecution, and they, in turn, would help stop the flow of cocaine into the U.S., end quote. The cartel lawyer told the Miami attorney that cartel leader Jorge Ochoa, quote, finances both Sandinista and anti-Sandinista forces in Nicaragua by setting up drug operations there, end quote. The Miami attorney then met with Jorge Ochoa and other leaders of the cartel. At these meetings in Medellin, cartel principals told the Miami attorney that they had invited him to meet with them to act as a representative to, quote, open negotiations with the U.S. government, end quote. Ochoa told the Miami attorney that the cartel had, quote, certain information which could be of interest to the national security of the United States, end quote, regarding developments in Nicaragua, Cuba, Mexico, Panama, and Colombia. Ochoa told the Miami attorney that the cartel had, quote, worked with the communists in the past, end quote. Ochoa stated that, quote, there was a 100,000-man army of radicals in the mountains consisting of Palestinians, Libyans, Peruvians, Argentinians, Ecuadorians, and Cubans, which were better equipped than the army of the Republic of Colombia and had received arms from Libya, end quote. The cartel leaders told the Miami attorney that they wished to, quote, work for American intelligence by supplying information about guerrilla activities, thereby incurring amnesty for their efforts, end quote. The cartel leaders proposed, quote, to have their representatives collect intelligence for a period of 6 months to a year, thereby assisting the U.S. government in getting the intelligence it needs on the communist guerrilla problem. At the end of this time period, they would receive amnesty or an end to their extradition proceedings, end quote. The Miami attorney returned to the United States with the cartel's offer, relayed it to U.S. authorities, and passed a polygraph regarding this account. The DEA and FBI then decided that conversations with the cartel would be inappropriate and subsequently broke off all contact with the Miami attorney. The material provided by the Miami attorney was not subjected to further investigation by either agency in connection with Nicaragua or the Contras. Additional allegations about Sandinista involvement in drug trafficking came from Barry Seal, who worked as a DEA informant after he was caught smuggling drugs. Seal was given the task of documenting the relationship of the Cubans and the Nicaraguans by using cameras installed in a plane he flew as part of an undercover operation. Seal flew to Nicaragua and obtained photographs of a Federico Vaughn, who U.S. authorities identified as a Nicaraguan government official, and Pablo Escobar, loading Seal's plane with drugs. The material gathered by Seal became the central evidence thereafter used by U.S. officials citing Sandinista involvement in narcotics. After the Seal operation was exposed, Federico Vaughn disappeared, and no further information about the Seal allegations materialized. The House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime found that the phone number used by Vaughn and calls he received from Seal was a phone number controlled by the U.S. Embassy since 1985 and by the U.S. Embassy or other foreign missions continuously since 1981. In its International Narcotics Control Strategy report regarding Nicaragua, the State Department noted that there is no evidence of the use of Nicaragua to ship drugs to the U.S., quote, since the allegations made in 1984, end quote, in connection with the Seal case. Summary and conclusions. The subcommittee testimony regarding Cuban involvement in narcotics trafficking was consistent with the findings of the State Department in its most recent U.S. International Narcotics Control Strategy report. That report notes, quote, U.S. law enforcement agencies report the routine use of Cuban airspace and territorial waters as safe havens against U.S. interdiction efforts. Some of the flights or sailings may enjoy the sanction of Cuban authorities, as there has been some reporting that Cuban authorities have permitted narcotics traffickers to use this strategic location in exchange for facilitating Cuban aid to guerrillas and subversive elements in third countries." End quote. As the State Department report recognized, quote, "corruption exists in Cuba's malfunctioning economy," end quote. It is difficult to determine whether the involvement of Cuban officials with drug traffickers is a matter of personal corruption or, as Jose Blandon testified, a matter of policy by the Cuban government. This is Our Hidden History